Thank you so much for being here today to celebrate the life of my dad, Sam Peake. He lived an extraordinary life, one of full of adventure, resilience, and kindness. He had a quiet strength, a sense of humor, and a deep love for music, family, and stories. As one of our close friends shared, and I quote, Sam was the kindest, most gentle man that I've ever met. He was selfless in a way that could make other men reflect on themselves around him. His patience was infectious and humor truly unique. He made me think about how much he had lived the life we have. He was able to see this world at its very best. He was truly one of the great ones. He was loved by family and friends and will be missed greatly, but remembered always because he left behind so much to be talked about for years to come. Another friend shared, he was the man, the myth, and will always be the legend. Growing up, my dad kept the poem of Attitude by Charles Swindoll in his home office, which I now proudly post in mine. It says, the longer I live, the more I realize the impact of attitude in my life. Attitude to me is more important than facts. It is more important than the past, than education, than money, than circumstances, than failures, than successes, than what other people think, say, or do. It is more important than appearance, giftedness, or skill. It will make or break a company, a church, a home. The remarkable thing is we have a choice every day regarding the attitude we embrace for that day. We cannot change our past. We cannot change the fact that people will act in a certain way. We cannot change the inevitable. The only thing we can do is play the one string we have, and that's our attitude. And boy, did Dad play his attitude well. When I was little, my mom often worked second shift, which meant Dad had bedtime duty. He'd tuck me in, kneel beside my bed, and instead of telling fairy tales, he'd tell me his stories, stories from his life. And today I'd like to share some of those stories with you. But before we begin, I want to share a short video I took of my dad, without him knowing, where he was sharing part of his journey to my cousins. It starts with him reminiscing about his uncle, which would be his father's brother, and the path that led him across the world.
And he had an uncle worked in China for the gas and electric companies.
Okay.
And my mother was born in Binghamton, right down the road here.
Yeah.
And she went to Syracuse U. And when she was about 20 years old, Syracuse started a missionary thing in China. Anyway, it was not on the coast. Shanghai is on the coast,
On the coast.
but Chongqing is inland. And my dad went to Chongqing with a company that did a lot of shipping.
Oh, okay.
Trucks and ocean-going boats. And they met, got married, and but the situation was bad. Pirates and
Yeah.
bad guys, and
Yeah.
China was not all one country. I mean, it was all one country, but there were pockets of this guy run it, this guy run it,
Oh,
this
right.
guy, and so there was trouble there. So they said, "We'll go to England, stay a year." Went to Canada, stayed a year, then came to the United States.
Oh,
To understand Dad's story, we have to start with his roots. His father, William Augustus Peake, also known as William and later Bill Bailey, left England at just 19 to make his way to Chongqing, China, where he worked managing ships and trucks for a trading company. Then he worked his way up and became a British Army captain in the Royal Artillery. Matter of fact, Dad shared that he started in the Army by hand carrying messages across enemy lines on his motorcycle. Why? Because he was super quick to fix it if it broke down. His mother, my namesake, Elizabeth Ann Heller, was born in Binghamton, New York. She was smart, independent, and adventurous. After studying languages, history, and first aid at SU, she joined the missionary program as a teacher secretary that took her all the way to China in 1922. That's where she met my grandpa. They fell in love and were married on October 16th, 1924. He was 39 and she was 29. Their unlikely meeting in a foreign land set the stage for everything that came next, including my dad's incredible story. Dad was born in Shanghai, China on August 21st, 1928. He often shared how his mom made it back to the States to have his brother Bill, but decided it wasn't worth it for him. Well, that's what he joked, anyways. Life in Shanghai wasn't easy. The city was hot, crowded, and full of unrest. My grandparents did their best to raise two boys in that world, growing up among missionaries, traders, and constant change. Shanghai was a unique place, shaped by its mix of influences. Japan, for instance, was a collection of small islands under a centralized government for centuries. But China was so vast that whoever held power in each region ruled it in their own way. Traveling just 10 to 20 miles could mean finding a different dialect or custom. The few cars that existed rarely traveled that far. The city was still mainly connected by foot and bicycle. In Shanghai, there were these little settlement areas. There was an American settlement, and Dad and his family lived in what was called the English International Settlement of Shanghai, which was like an English town, a place filled with Europeans and some Americans who had their own areas within the city. One of those families was that of J.G. Ballard, who would later write Empire of the Sun about his own childhood in Shanghai. Ballard's father was actually a witness at my grandparents' wedding, and Dad attended the same school as Ballard, pictured below. And years later, Dad would say his story is mostly true. Dad could give you dates and details about his life, which I always found so fascinating. As a boy, he loved soccer. Though he was often picked last for being the shortest, he quickly earned respect. He would say, even though he was right handed, he became left footed, racing that ball down the left side of the field. He also shared that when walking to school, he and his brother Bill would be cutting through alleyways, and he would always stop to pet the stray cats. Well, one time, one bit him right between his thumb and forefinger, and it wouldn't let go. He and Bill struggled to get it off him. At school, Bill couldn't wait to tell everyone. Did Sam tell you he got bit by a cat? All the kids were eager to find this cat, and when they did, they discovered it was dead. It had rabies. Well, that landed him in the hospital getting rabies shots that are not for the weak. Summers in Shanghai were scorching. To escape, Dad and his brother Bill would spend summers at a Red Cross camp in Qingdao, or known back then as Tsingtao, a coastal city once shaped by German and Japanese influence. Those summers, he always said, were among his happiest childhood memories. Dad also shared that they always had cats and dogs around the house. One of his favorite memories was at Christmas time, before they had electric lights for the tree. His mom used these old clothespin like candle holders, and they'd light them up. Of course, his dad would just about have a heart attack every time, worried that the dry tree would catch fire. But Dad assured us they only left the candles burning for about an hour before blowing them all out, just to be safe. When the war reached China and the American settlement was bombed, everything changed. It was 1938, the situation worsened, and they worried their settlement may be next. My grandparents decided it was time to leave. It wasn't easy. Visas, permissions, and routes were limited, but they managed to secure passage out. His dad, part of the Royal Artillery, stayed behind. Dad, his brother Bill, and his mom left by boat. First, they went to England, where they stayed for a year with his father's family, then to Canada, waiting nearly another year because they couldn't get Dad a visa for the United States. Finally, he arrived in Greene, spending another year with his mother's family. After years of moving across continents, he was finally safe, starting over in a new country and carrying stories from a half world away. When he left China, that was the last time all four of them ever lived together. When Dad came to New York, his teenage years were full of both responsibility and resilience. See, his mom had been diagnosed with cancer and needed treatment. And his father was at this time working in New York City, a life that was really too fast and too crowded for Dad. So they had Dad boarded with families in Oneida Castle, living much of his youth among strangers who soon became like family. From 1942 to 1945, he stayed with the Hellman family, working on their farm and later in their factory on Elizabeth Street in Oneida. In the beginning, he was too young to handle the dangerous milking machines, so he delivered raw milk to the families in town, a job that helped him get to know just about every person who lived in Oneida Castle. He spent his high school years between school and work, but one of his most significant events was meeting his friend, Walt Blau. Later, Walt and his wife Anne became my godparents. One summer, Dad and Walt worked at an ice house. They would make blocks of ice the size of bales of hay, which were sold to farmers or those who didn't have refrigeration. The ice house was located about 100 feet off the road near Route 5 and Main Street going towards Syracuse. It looked like a big barn. They would freeze and store the ice and then ship it to big grocery stores and others who needed it. Walt and Dad spent a whole summer loading and unloading these massive ice blocks. After his time with the Helmers, he boarded with Howard and Milmo Streeter, and their family became his as well. I would later have the chance to meet them, and they were known to me as Grandma and Grandpa Streeter. Dad started playing the piano in high school with his friend Walt and their buddy Ed Cook, whose father once played piano in silent movies and taught them a few chords. That's how it began: Dad plucking chords, Walt singing, and the music taking root. Dad always said that most farmhouses back in the day had pianos, even if nobody played them. So Dad and Walt would show up, sometimes hauling an old upright into the back of a pickup truck to bring it up to the second story to play a gig. They played in barns, living rooms, and later spots like the Hotel Rainier and the Brown Jug. At first, they only knew about 10 songs. They'd play them all, toss in a square dance or a polka, and then start right over again. Over time, listening to the radio, they picked up more. Dad especially loved polkas. He'd often laugh and say, "I really thought I was hot stuff on the guitar until I heard a real guitar player." He shared that he was inspired by Guy Lombardo and Bob Wills and the Texas Playboys. They played nearly every weekend around Oneida and Canastota. Dad said it seemed like Fridays were for the married couples and Saturdays all the singles went out. Their first gig paid them about $5 or $6. Good money back then. Dad shared that most of the high school band kids were doing the same kind of thing back then. You could walk down Madison Street and hear someone playing at one of the 10 or 12 spots scattered around town. And of course, there were the teenage adventures, like the time Dad thought he could outrun the cops in his Model T in the United Castle Park. He was wrong. Or the nights at the ice cream parlor, buying a banana split for 25 cents that took 15 minutes to make and 15 minutes to eat. Dad even built his own motorcycle, and on the registration it said homemade under model. After graduating high school in 1947, Dad wasn't quite sure what came next. His father had been paying for his board, but with school behind him and the war over, the path forward wasn't clear. He decided to keep learning and he enrolled at the New York State Institute of Applied Arts and Sciences, which later became MVCC. It was a new program at the time filled with returning veterans and a few younger students like him. He studied mechanical engineering, business, and liberal arts, though he'd later joke that he never really used that degree. He had looked into becoming a U.S. citizen, but was told it was a lengthy process that could take upwards of 6 years to obtain, and he needs to take classes, which he decided to hold off for a while. After college, life opened up into possibility. He and his good friend Walt decided to see America, really see it. They each saved $400, which was a lot back then, and then they hit the road. It was 1951, and they were about the ages of 21, 22, and they spent 6 weeks on the road, covering nearly 40 states. They took the southern route first, looped back through the north, and finished down the middle. Most nights they slept in the car. Every few days they'd splurge on a motel. Motel 6, which he said used to really be $6 a night. He loved that trip. The freedom, the music, the endless horizon. He said everyone should take a trip like that at least once in their life. Maybe just not sleep in the car. A few years later, in 1954, he and another friend, Leon Dixon, decided to hit the road again, this time heading west to Arizona. They heard about opportunities out there and they wanted to see what they could find. Along the way, they met a man selling his trailer park in Phoenix, promising it was easy money and a good life. So, of course, they took the leap and bought it. Turned out wasn't quite the gold mine they were told, but it wasn't a failure either. They stuck it out a few years, learning a lot about business and life. And somewhere in there, Dad had one of those what was I thinking moments when his buddies were like, "Hey, you want to go out for the night?" And so he's like, "Yeah," and hopped in the back of the pickup truck that crossed the Mexican border. He just about had a panic attack, thinking, "Oh my gosh, I'm not a citizen. I'm not going to get back in." When he did, he vowed never to leave the country again. After that border scare, he decided it was time to stop putting it off. He was going to officially become an American. In 1955, he took the steps to get his U.S. citizenship. It wasn't a quick process, but he was determined. He studied, filled out all the paperwork, went through all the interviews. He had already lived in the U.S. for years by then, built a life here, worked, paid taxes, and loved this country. He just needed that piece of paper to make it official. When the day finally came, he said it felt both ordinary and deeply meaningful. No fireworks, no big ceremony, just a quiet sense of pride and belonging. And he was certainly proud to be an American. While in Arizona, Dad found steady work with the Arizona Public Service, the local gas and electric company. He used to tell a story about a coworker who had been a German Navy radio operator during World War II. One day, Dad asked him, "So, where were you in November of 1939?" The man said, "In a submarine in the North Atlantic, hunting English ships." Dad laughed and said, "You rascal, you missed me." That moment always stuck with him. How two men who might have been enemies could later work side by side, share stories, and laugh. In those years, his good friend Leon, who was married, had suffered great loss and eventually moved back to New York. Dad stayed behind, working weekends for the utility company and playing piano on the weekends. Music was his heartbeat. In 1955, while gigging in Prescott, he met Lee and Ruby Dominguez, a couple with their own band. They brought him in, and together they filled Arizona dance halls with life and laughter. A few years later, Ruby and Lee dreamed of opening a music store. Dad wasn't sure. What do I know about retail? He'd say. But they took the leap and they opened Arizona Music Center in Phoenix in 1960. He even helped co write a beginner's guitar book for Fender. For nearly a decade, he poured himself into that store, mostly staying out of the spotlight and working in the back, repairing instruments. By 1969, he sold his share and began to feel the pull of home again. That chapter had given him music, friendships, and even his first girl, Diana Lee, Ruby's daughter. By 1970, Dad returned to Oneida, New York, ready for a fresh start. Music was never far from his heart. He played in a band again, sharing his love for piano and performing wherever he could. Around that time, he met my mom, Madeline, a hardworking single mom raising her son, Tony. She was juggling multiple jobs, waiting tables at night, and working at a small coffee shop during the day. And Dad admired her determination, her strength, and her warmth. They married on June 16th, 1973, and Dad legally adopted Tony soon after. On Easter morning in 1974, I delighted them with my presents. Those years were full of love, family, and music. Dad worked as a draftsman, and Mom continued her jobs as a nurse and a waitress. Together, they built a home filled with music, laughter, and love. But life has a way of testing even the strongest hearts. For us, 1995 was a year that no one could have prepared for. On September 27th, we lost Tony. A few weeks later, on October 18th, his first granddaughter was born, a bright new light amidst the heartbreak. And then, November 12th, Mom passed away. In just a matter of weeks, Dad had buried his son, lost his wife, and stepped into a life as a widower while welcoming a new generation into the family. Though it all, Through it all, he kept going. He carried on with a quiet strength, leaning on music, family, and the connection he had nurtured over a lifetime. That resilience, that ability to find light even in the darkest time, was a defining part of who he was. A few years later, after those painful losses, Dad decided to revisit Arizona to see if the old Arizona Music Center was still around. He found it had been downsized, now a small space inside a larger place called a swap mart. He reconnected with Ruby, who had been divorced by this time, and shared how she worked tirelessly to keep the store alive. Seeing her dedication and resilience reminded him of the early days of music, hard work, and the passion of music they had shared. Back in New York, he couldn't stop thinking about Ruby. He played old reel to reels, made frequent long distance phone calls, and nurtured the bond that they had rekindled. Eventually, he moved back to Arizona and they married on Valentine's Day, Vegas style. And with Ruby, Dad became part of another family once again, loving her children and grandchildren as his own, sharing music, laughter, and a full life together. Even across miles, he had a way of making connections feel close. He would end letters and calls with me with a "We smile at miles," a simple phrase that carried so much meaning. Those years brought him joy, companionship, and the reminder that life could start anew, no matter what had come before. Dad had spent the next 20 years in Arizona, living a full life with Ruby until her passing. After celebrating his 90th birthday in Arizona, Dad agreed to move in with me and my family back in New York. Even at 90, he wasn't slowing down. He drafted plans for our garage, surveyed the property, and approached projects with the same curiosity and determination he carried his whole life. Music remained central. You could find him watching piano tutorials, playing old favorites, and even teaching himself the steel guitar. And of course, he indulged in one of his simple pleasures, ordering godly amounts of Tootsie Rolls off Amazon, and continued to share his stories of his incredible life. Dad's life in his 90s reminds all of us that age is no barrier to curiosity, creativity, or joy. He continued to embrace life fully on his own terms with humor, music, and a little bit of mischief. Dad would say, I have lots of stories. If you ask anyone my age, they will have lots of stories. And he was right. His life was full of adventures, challenges, music, love, loss, and laughter, each moment leaving a chapter behind. Even in his final years, Dad showed us how to really live. He taught us to stay curious. There's always something new to learn, a new skill to try, or a new song waiting to be played. To keep moving and keep creating, because age is just a number and life is meant to be lived all the way through. To treasure family and friends, to nurture those connections near or far and make the distance feel small. To laugh often and to find joy in the simple things like a banana split, a piano chord, or a Tootsie Roll from Amazon. And most of all, to face life's challenges with resilience because, yes, loss will come, but so will love, new beginnings, and laughter. And now, I want to leave you with something special, a glimpse of Dad doing what he loved most. On this day, he looked over and said, Do you like cowboys? I laughed and said, Of course I like cowboys. He smiled, turned to the piano, and began to play.
We like cowboys.
Oh yeah.
If everyone will please raise your glasses. Here's to the man, the myth, the legend, my dad, Sam Peake, a man who lived with music in his heart, humor in his soul, and love that stretched across every mile. Until we meet again, we smile at miles.